Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Dear participant and guest, marhaban bikum and welcome. As part of our ISC2 Jazair chapter activity, we are delighted to have you today join us for this webinar on cloud migration security challenge, which become a concern and hot topic for many organizations across the world, willing to move their system, application, and data to cloud environment. My name is Sofiane Shafai, and I'm the ISC2 Al Jazair chapter president. On behalf of our chapter member, I would like to thank the ISC2 London chapter, Liz Banburi, the president of the chapter, and Bipin Kulkarni for the collaboration by making this event happens with the participation of our today's speaker, Mr. Ozinachi Ozosheta from the London chapter. Ozinachi is a cybersecurity expert with hands-on experience in cloud migration project. He has worked in various environments and he has been involved in several volunteering activity. For instance, the Center Cybersecurity Safety and Education from ISC2. He is a member of the British Computer Society, and he is acting as an IT manager in private organization based in UK. A few words on our ISC2 Jazair chapter. So as you may know, the chapters becomes official chapter from the beginning of this year. We are actually almost 40 members, all of them security professional working in different sector. As a chapter, we aim to organize a monthly event to bring value to our members and of course attract more new members to our chapter. Okay, some housekeeping rules before starting the talk. The chat is available, so feel free to ask any question. We will take all of them and answer at the end during the Q&A session. All participants will be credited with 1 CPE, so make sure that to attend at least 45 minutes to be eligible. And the webinar will be recorded and we will make it available on our LinkedIn page. Okay, so without further delay, I will hand over to you, Ozinachi. The floor is yours. Thank you. You can start, Ozzy. Yeah? We are not hearing you. Maybe you are on mute.
Okay, are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm glad to be here, and thanks for the opportunity, Sofiane and ISC2. You know, back in Algeria, it's a great privilege to be here, everyone. Thank you for your time. Okay, so here today, we're going to be talking about cloud migration security challenges. Yeah, of course. We'll just go ahead and see what we're going to cover within this period we have. Okay, so we'll look at the journey to the cloud. Okay, so how this has, happened over time. And then we'll look at the cloud shared responsibility, model. Of course, that's something that is very important, is key to see who has responsibility for what. All right, and then we'll also look at, practical examples of, common, projects I've done over the time, of course, talking about, cloud migration projects. And then we'll look at what, data residency regulations. Is one thing moving to the cloud, is another thing to know exactly, the things to look out for. What are the security concerns? In choosing a cloud service provider, for instance, what should we look out for? What should be the basic considerations? And then we'll go through, a practical checklist of security considerations when it comes to cloud migration. And of course, we'll have time for Q&A. Okay. All right. So the journey to the cloud. Of course, um, we all started our career, of course, as IT. Meanwhile, I understand that the audience is mixed. We've got IT security professionals. We've also got, some persons who are, have the intention to get into the field. So I will make it such that it's going to be, I'll be able to communicate to everyone. So, of course, looking at the down history line, we see that it's all about on premises just before now, server workloads, data applications. Of course, for me as a person, that's where I started. I had everything, managing the server, storage, applications, databases, of course, in the networking, everything was, in-house. Okay. So, but I mean, things have evolved at this point. We now have what is called a cloud first IT infrastructure era. That's where we find ourselves. All right. So, and of course, consistently, gradually, increasingly, organizations are moving their businesses to the cloud. And then, of course, the advantages, of course, the question is what could be driving this move? It's things like, of course, the advantages the cloud provides, disaster recovery, it lowers the total cost of ownership, capital expenses, instead of having about maybe 10 physical machines in your organization as servers, you could just have maybe one or two running some critical applications you may not want to take to the cloud yet, and then you have rest of the workload moved to the cloud. So it reduces those expenses of managing, an in-house data center. Of course, improved productivity and then scalable infrastructure, among several other advantages. So you see that today businesses are defaulting to cloud-based services, and a recent research by Foundry in 2023 has seen that over 30% of IT, tech budgets is going to, cloud allocations, cloud technologies. And this has also, led to the springing up of new roles and functions within the IT and security space. So now we hear things like cloud security engineers, cloud administrators. So you see that it's actually a question of when an organization will move to the cloud, not if they will really move to the cloud. However, there, as we progress, we will see that indeed it's not really every of organizations' data that must be on the cloud. And that's where we see things like private cloud, hybrid, and the rest. So we'll see more as we proceed. So this is the outlook of today's IT environment. So we see that more than half of businesses have their infrastructure, their data in the cloud. And the projection for the next 18 months, this is as at the end of 2023. So into this year, 2024, and in the next 6 months, 6 months following 2024, there's going to be over 11% increase in cloud adoption. All right. So if you do the mathematics, so you see that probably in less than a decade, you'll be hitting over, 90%. All right. So it may not be 100% indeed. All right. So now, I would like us to have a look at this, the cloud shared responsibility model. This is very important, because it shapes the foundation for, the security in the cloud. Who has responsibility for what, right? It's not just about moving things to the cloud. It's about understanding how the cloud works and what you're to do as a business. I must say that we shouldn't forget where we are coming from. We shouldn't throw, on-premises hosting of information to the bin because cloud has come. In fact, I must tell you that that was watertight security because you have your data, you have everything within your environment. You have your controls. All right. So now, this cloud share responsibility defines, the customer and, cloud service provider responsibilities as regarding infrastructure, data security, and compliance. Then it goes ahead to tell us, what are the customers', responsibilities. Of course, that depends on the type of infrastructure that, cloud infrastructure that the organization has adopted, whether it's infrastructure as a cloud service, infrastructure as a service, sorry, or is it software as a service, and then, so you see that when it comes to this responsibility, the CSP, which is the cloud service provider, is responsible for security of the cloud, while the customer is responsible for security in the cloud. So we'll see more about this as we proceed. So, what this means is that the cloud service provider, for instance, Amazon, AWS, or Microsoft, for instance, is responsible for the infrastructure, the data center, wherever, it's situated around the world. But the customer is responsible for whatever they put on that infrastructure. All right. So an instance to that is, for instance, when you have moved a local server you had in your environment, let's say a server that is running a Microsoft, maybe SQL server, for instance, you moved it to as a VM instance to the cloud. You wouldn't want to put firewall configurations that will allow access from anywhere or from any IP address by using 0.0.0/0, but you may want to specify certain IP address range. So that's like a security step we can take to ensure security in the cloud. All right. Now, if we look at this diagram, it explains it better in a graphical format. So if we look at the columns, we have the first one is on premises. Like I mentioned earlier, this is watertight security. All right. The organization, you're responsible for everything in terms of security. However, you're responsible for the physical infrastructure, network virtualization, and the rest. So if we look at the second column, infrastructure as a cloud, you see that the cloud service provider is responsible for the physical infrastructure, networking, virtualization, but you as the business, you're responsible for the operating system. So this is an example of renting a Windows server, for instance, in the cloud. All right. So you're responsible for the Windows operating system, patching it, updating, ensuring that it's safe. Then the applications installed on that server, you're also responsible for it. And then the data, of course, that you put in, identity and access management to the application is solely your responsibility. If we move further right to platform as a service, this an example of this is, of course, like for developers, if having a software development environment, so the cloud service provider is responsible from ground up to the operating system, but the application you used to deploy, make your developments, you're responsible for it, and of course the data. And further down, software as a service. A typical example could be an email service. Most organizations use, of course, Microsoft Outlook, or Google Suite and the rest. You see that at that point, your responsibility for the infrastructure drops. The cloud service provider takes responsibility for that, but for your data, you are responsible. And of course, access control. So you see that there is something common in all these types of cloud infrastructure, and that is your data and access. And this is where the security is most pertinent. All right. So if we progress now to the next slide, we'll see that narrowing it down specifically to security, concerns, you see that for infrastructure as a cloud as a service, the cloud service provider is responsible for physical security. But when you move up to things like application level controls, the business is responsible. All right. Identity and access management, the responsible client endpoint protection, the business is responsible, of course, and the data classification accountability, the business is responsible. As you move further down to the right, you see that that responsibility, of course, moves up to the end user in terms of towards the data. But going downwards to the infrastructure, the cloud provider is responsible. So it's important to understand this because of course the first question you want to ask for trying to migrate resources to the cloud is to know what type of data do I have, and then that will now determine the type of cloud model to choose. So this helps to establish security baselines, okay, of course, which are aligned to compliance requirements, industry standards, and platform recommendations. So, and again, there's need to regularly measure the workload and then ensure that the security posture is improved over time. So that's the advantage of having this. Okay. Now, of course, this topic is about cloud migration and the security concerns around it. What is it all about? Of course, it's just the process of moving, workloads. It could be some, it could be all, but in practice, I can say it's some, not 100%. It depends on the business needs, really. All right. So I'm moving those, from on-premises data centers, from your organizational network infrastructure to cloud-based infrastructure. I must say that it is a complex process indeed. The reason is because this is something, or I will use the instance of a building, trying to repurpose a building or trying to renovate a building, right? You want to add more rooms, you want to move people off the floors, and then repaint and things like that. It's more it's more tasking to do that, because you have to put a lot of things into consideration. You need to, to be sure that people will continue to work in the office. So you have to move their computers at a time that it will not disrupt their job functions. You need to ensure that the network connectivity is still in place because people are in the building. All right. So it requires proper planning because in the course of doing your migration, you wouldn't want to cause a downtime. All right. So you would want to do it in such a way that it will be seamless and, of course, business processes continues. All right. So good planning is important, is essential to its success. And a crucial part of ensuring this is ensuring that the data remains secure throughout the entire process, from pre-migration, during the migration, and post-migration. As we move on, we'll see the specific steps that we need to take. Yeah, because you wouldn't want to, have a data theft along the way, probably by using migration tools that don't use proper authentication mechanisms or encryption mechanisms. So it's important to ensure that the data is safe throughout the process. That is the ultimate goal, in addition to ensuring business continuity. All right, so why is it really important? Why do we need to make our migration secure? Why do we have to have these security considerations? Is, of course, to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of organizational data during, before, and after the migration. All right, and of course, mitigate against data theft and, of course, business continuity, as I mentioned, earlier. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I would like to make this as practical as possible. In the course of my career, I've, been able to do lots of this in different roles I have been in at different times. All right. So, and I will start from, the more like the most recent. I just handled this about 3 weeks ago, and it was all about, migrating our authentication system to Microsoft Azure. So that's for Active Directory federated service. So what basically is used for, allowing users to sign on to other applications using their Active Directory credentials. All right. So that's more like single sign-on. So prior to that, we had an on-premise Windows server, all right, that is set up as the federated, service, server, and it was integrated with the local Active Directory to authenticate users on whatever application, integrated applications that they need to sign on to. But at some point, we realized that it's not. We needed it to scale. We needed that to be more resilient. All right. So we now thought of moving that to the cloud. All right. So as we speak, the Microsoft Azure is doing that function now, and it's called So it's no longer federated. It's now managed. So it's now on a managed authentication service. So another example of a project I've done is email system. This is very common, of course, coming from back in the years. It was Microsoft Exchange email servers that were all available within organizations, but now Exchange Online is there and Azure. So moving everyone's mailboxes to Microsoft 365 is, of course, email is critical to any business. And you wouldn't want a situation where after doing the migration, you have, you lose data integrity. Probably users are unable to, see their mailboxes or their archives mailboxes and things like that. Then a similar one was also of course, SAN storage, right? Of course, traditional storage systems, yeah. But now, at some point, there was need to move to the cloud to OneDrive and SharePoint. All right, so that's very key. I mean, because this is more like organizational historical data. Some are sensitive data and things like that. So, and then of course, SharePoint, on premises to SharePoint online, legacy accounting applications and their databases moving to the cloud. Azure, of course, Active Directory, like I mentioned earlier, but this is now having Active Directory database on the cloud, all right? And then, of course, server workloads, infrastructure as a service, moving them to, of course, server lifting, just lifting up, the server up to the cloud. So these are example projects amongst many others. Now, this is very important. So also looking at the security considerations, I want us to look at something called the data resiliency. All right. So now, because the cloud services are, of course, the cloud service providers have their data centers all around the world in different locations. It's important to consider this because these are laws and regulations that exist in different places. Okay, different countries and regions have their laws, and some are very specific about this. Using Algeria as an example, the Algeria data regulation is very specific to localization of data. Some other regulations are not quite specific, right? But so it's just a matter of time, I would say. So now, so it's about data resilience or localization. Is about ensuring that data remains in a specific geographical region. So and it's for certain sensitive data such as personally identifiable information, financial data, healthcare data, payments data. You know, there are some are expected to reside in certain regions. So now I will quickly, share uh, this link, and this is by Microsoft. Uh, so that's Azure Data Regions. So this will show us the different. For instance, if you want to use Azure to migrate your cloud infrastructure, you see that you could choose regions within your location where according to your requirements, according to your data privacy and data resilience requirements. So for instance, in Africa, we've got Johannesburg and Cape Town as regions. And the beautiful thing is that the cloud providers are beginning to spring up more regions around the world, as they are rolling out more and more. So that's part of that. Okay. All right. So that's talking about, of course, data, residency and the information. So this requires doing some research about the cloud service provider you intend to use. For instance, if you want to use Microsoft Azure or AWS, it's good to go through their documentation, find out where their data is stored, which regions, do they have data centers. That is very, important consideration to make there. All right. Now, if we proceed, so if we look at this map here, we will see, this shows different countries around the world as relating data residency regulations. So you see that some regions have pending regulations, some have lightly regulated, and then some are quite regulated, while some are heavily. So if we look at the map here for Africa, we could see that Algeria is within the category of regulated, and then a country like Morocco is heavily regulated. So it's good to have this knowledge before proceeding to make the decision of the cloud provider to use and even the cloud model to use as well. So we'll quickly run through this checklist, which tells us how much we are to um, involvement, practical steps to take in ensuring cloud security. So first of all is to, of course, identify the cloud service provider. So this sets the foundation, like I said, because it helps you to identify the regulatory concerns, data center locations, compliance certifications. And I must say the cloud service providers are very much transparent with this information. They let you know, oh, we have this compliance certification for this region or for that other region. And then, of course, pricing as well. It helps to determine all this. And when that is done, the next thing is to evaluate and choose the cloud deployment type, like we mentioned earlier. Is it infrastructure as a service you want? Is it platform? But this is really dependent on business needs. The requirements of your business will determine. For instance, if your business is involved in payment processing, for instance, you may want to go for software as a service or something called function as a service. Function as a service is fairly new in this model, which is all about just using just running a code, for instance, only when it's needed. For instance, only when a payment is being processed, a function is run, a code gets run on the cloud infrastructure. That way, you don't even need a server, you don't need the operating system, you don't even need the platform, you don't even need to have the entire software. It's just that time that you need to process the payments. So if your business is doing function as a service, that will help you to know the kind of model to choose. And then yeah, of course. Then also is important to document existing systems, because this is important when you document. It helps you to know your dependencies, your configurations. For instance, the recent migration I mentioned, the authentication system, uh, we needed to document all the applications that are reliant on that Active Directory server. Doing that was important for us so that by the time we finish the migration, we're able to check that all the applications are still integrated. If we don't have that checklist, you would not know what to check at the end of the day. So for instance, if you're doing email migration, Outlook to the cloud, you will want to take note of your mail exchange record that you've done on your domain provider, because by the time you finish migrating to the cloud instance, to Microsoft 365, you would want to edit your mail exchange record so that you will now point that to Microsoft 365 address, so that emails will no longer drop on your on-premises server, but now will be redirected to Microsoft 365. So that's very important to take note of all that. Then Still talking about pre-migration security considerations, sensitive data must be encrypted. This is very important. I mean, and this is also part of the reason why most organizations are skeptical, especially the public sector, and are skeptical about the cloud. Or, of course, it's not everything that must be in the cloud, I must say. So that is important to have those information, encrypted, such that so that the migration will not be susceptible to man in the middle attacks and things like that. All right. So, and then, of course, it's good to also set up a secure conduit for that data to move from your on-premises environment to the cloud. In fact, there is a type of migration that involves physical movement of storage from your organization to the cloud service provider's data center. There is an option for that. The cloud provider, depending on the size of your infrastructure on your data, it can be moved physically, So that's to ensure that the data is safe. All right. This is very important. Now, let's look at post-migration. When the migration is completed, you've used all the tools and ensured security, implementations along the way. You would want to plan the decommissioning of the previous application, except you're running, a hybrid system where you need the tool to be running. So, and in doing that, it's good to consider data retention policies. Several organizations have their policies around data retention, how long you can keep a data before you get it off. So it's important to have those considerations, and then test the integrity of your data. There are data validation tools that you can use, and then performance testing as well, because you want to be sure that what you have on the cloud is a replica of what you had within your organizational infrastructure. And then vulnerability testing, very important. Of course, this is one of the most common cyber attacks that are out there. Of course, having different types of vulnerabilities being exploited. So we want to do that. For instance, if you have a SQL server instance, you want to be sure that it has the right level of access and protection implemented. And then, of course, necessary firewall rules. The good thing about cloud platforms is that a good attempt has been made to make the technology as secure as possible. So, in my opinion, is more about what the cloud engineer or the cybersecurity expert is able to do in administering it. And then of course, there is no foolproof system really. There is no absolute security per se. But however, there are integrations and implementations that have been made. There are firewalls integrated with the cloud systems where you can close ports that are not needed and open specific ports that are needed. You can allow specific IP address ranges. You can allow specific traffic from specific countries and locations. So those are post migration. Now, when you're operational, you have succeeded in doing your migration, what are the things to do? What are the security, concerns that you must? Because I mean, there's the tendency to say, "Oh, the migration went smoothly. Oh, now it's time to, to jubilate." Not yet. All right. So it's good to establish data backup and recovery strategy. This is one mistake many people make. No, some wrong notion some people have, thinking that if your data on the cloud is being backed up by your cloud service provider, is not true. For instance, if you have Office 3, Microsoft Exchange email, Microsoft is not responsible for backing up your emails. Of course, we saw that in the cloud responsibility model. Your data is your responsibility. So I've seen many people make this mistake. They don't put up a backup solution to their cloud data. It's important to do that, especially for emails and for every other thing. Now, because your data is in the cloud, really, it's not within your on-premises anymore. And and in as much as the cloud provider has provided some level of assurance, and of course you put up your firewall rules and all that, it's important to ensure that you put strong access control. A common thing to do is to have multi-factor authentication to, of course, that's part of identity and access management. It's important to have that control access to your cloud resources. Let the access be only to authorized, persons. Now, also, it's good to initiate monitoring and alerts. So, Security Operations Center has to, take up this new responsibility to monitor cloud deployments. All right. So the CM tools will have to, at this point, integrate your CM tools to look at your cloud resources, to watch for the bad actors, look at the logs, set up your alerts, and be sure that you're keeping an eye on your wall. All right, so that you wouldn't want someone to jump in and all right. So of course, that goes with training and education. So it's no longer about just awareness now. It's about intensive training and education. In this in the cloud era. And then, if within your organization, if you have got a cloud compliance officer or any equivalent person, it's good to have the approval of that person. Of course, that's having run through this checklist. All right. Okay. So lastly, just before the last one, so these are, in terms of the tools, because during migration, there are tools used. These tools are the things that will help you to migrate. If you're doing a entire server migration, if you're migrating just data, if you're migrating an application, there are several tools. So for instance, there is something called Azure Migrate. AWS has a tool also called AWS Application Migration Service, Google Cloud Migration Tools, and Datadog. There are several tools like that. So it's good to ensure that these tools have, equivalent, supported authentication methods. An example is SharePoint, Microsoft SharePoint. It supports ADFS authentication, MFA, SAMA-based claims. So whatever tool you want to use, ensure that those tools will support these mechanisms in order to ensure integrity of data. And again, it's good to also be mindful of the tool you want to use, where you're getting it from. It's good to get them from, of course, the proper vendor sites. And then if you're using third-party tools, I mean, I wouldn't use freewares for things like this. All right. And then it's good to also have a look at the product reviews and the security features of those tools. Yeah, because those tools are very important in that migration process. All right. Lastly, just to summarize, all right. So the truth is that there is no slowing down to cloud adoption. It has come to stay. All right. Every We may not have 100% every data being on the cloud, but just like we saw in the earlier slide, there is a massive growth of cloud adoption because of the advantages it offers. That also is equal to the risk involved. Of course, it has become a prime target for cyber attacks. All right. So because it's on the internet, and anything on the internet can be reached, potentially going by networking principles, except when you now have your firewall rules and things like that. So it's good to identify and assess the risks, and then before doing the migration. By the time you identify the risk, that will now determine what you can take to the cloud and what you can keep within. All right. Now, it's also important to select the cloud service provider that meets your security requirements. Of course, we made mention of data localization. So if the cloud service provider does not meet data localization, and that is a requirement for your organization or for the country where you are, you wouldn't want to go with that cloud service provider. You would want to go with the one that would comply. All right. So, and again, it's good to test, of course, security of your application in the cloud, encryption, identity and access management, and most importantly, to monitor your workloads. You must keep an eye to, on what you've got. All right. So at this point, I would say thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Ozinachi, for your this insightful presentation, content, and explanation. So let's move to the chat, to the question. We have a couple of questions. The first one is about. Let me check. Okay. Yes, the first one is about what tips you can share for migrating from one CSP to another.
Okay, that's very good question there. Yeah, because that's another form of migration, not just from on-premises, but from one cloud service provider to another. So it goes back to the migration tools. Well, so of course, first thing is to what is the reason for moving? So probably because your current cloud service provider doesn't meet your security requirements. It could even be for cost reasons, right? Yeah, of course. If you have, for instance, you have the cloud service provider having a data center in your city, is most likely that the cost might be lower, isn't it? So that could be the reason. So the tips for that is, of course, do the proper research for the next CSP that you intend to move to. Ensure that they have the right security requirements, data localization, encryption, and all that. And then, of course, costing. And of course, then you can go ahead, look at their migration tools, or the authentication mechanisms, their integration with, CM tools that will enable you to, do your security operations center properly. So these are, some of the tips that you could use, and also the volume of data or the nature of the data that you have. All right. And also you would also want to consider the amount of possible, we want to reduce the downtime as much as possible. So how proper planning is involved in that. So that's what I can say to that.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. Another question, can you share with us some of the challenge organization face while moving out from the cloud, going back on premises? What recommendation you can share for the CSP? Is there any strategy which need to be followed?
Hmm. That's very interesting question there. Yeah, because eh, the question is why would an organization make that decision? All right, going back from cloud back to to the infrastructure on premise. Probably they didn't do proper planning before going to the cloud. All right, probably they had moved some data that they feel that, oh, this shouldn't be. All right, so the initial assessment wasn't done properly. So for the side, the question is about what the cloud service provider can do. So I think it's to understand, to try to engage the customer, to understand the reason, for leaving. All right, that information is key. It could be, like I said, assessment was not done properly. It could be security concern. It could be that it could be cost as well.
Yeah.
They feel like they can't keep up with the cost of running the infrastructure. For instance, if they are doing infrastructure as a service, that's a lot running, the processors, memory, storage, and things like that. So it's good to understand how that happens. And again, of course, to any form of business incentives, could also encourage service and customers to implement. And again, expanding the infrastructure. I know it's business, really. Of course, is when you have more customers that you can build more data centers. But so having more data centers in more locations, would help. It's possible that that customer now has another cloud service provider just launching a data center in their city or in their country. They would rather move to, probably to comply with localization, regulations and things like that.
Okay. Another question, do you recommend a deployment on a multi-cloud environment as a solution to reduce vendor lock-in risk?
That's absolutely correct. I would recommend that indeed. All right, because you wouldn't want to get into vendor lock-in. All right, so it's great, but it also raises concerns about compliance to data privacy and regulation. But if you do your homework very well, do your research, understand each of the cloud providers policies and things, and if they all comply, sure, it's a way to have your resources spread out. That way, you increase resiliency as well. Yeah.
Another question, another technical question about how to select the proper encryption algorithm for data protection. Should we follow security framework such as NIST, or are there some consideration depending on our business activity, example, finance?
Well, I think I would say it's a mixture of both, right? So of course the framework is there. It is a framework. It is a guiding principle that will always be helpful anytime, any day. So, but also you also have to look at what the class service provider supports. Of course, they can only give what they have, right? And again, what your application also supports. But I mean, but with from experience, I found out that even if your application doesn't, probably it has legacy authentication. For instance, yeah, legacy authentications, protocols, the cloud, those migration tools um, can help you integrate modern protocols in order to get you over to the cloud. So mostly there is no limitation on moving to the cloud in terms of those security principles. The cloud service providers they've had that into they put that into consideration. After all, ideally, migration to the cloud is about moving legacy applications, isn't it? Or infrastructure to the cloud. So those have all been built in, but those frameworks really are there as as a helper anytime, any day.
Okay, okay. Maybe the last question from my side. It's when we select a region where the data should be stored at a cloud service provider, how can you ensure that this data will not be replicated in an area which might be non-compliant zone in the context of a business continuity at cloud provider side? So how we can make sure, how we can ensure that our data will not be replicated outside what we have selected when we contract with the CSP.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Is a really practical concern you've raised. Actually, the cloud service providers explicitly explains and makes it clear the regions that will replicate to your choice region. So
Okay.
for instance, yeah. So for instance, if you choose, you could also choose replications, yourself, right? So, but which is, I mean, yes, that's like you having control over that. So, but by default, for instance, if you want to choose, Azure, Johannesburg as your region, at that point, the cloud service provider will let you know that probably Brazil region or whatever region is going to replicate with this. So that's where you make that decision, or you could then change that, to the area that will comply, with the security concerns.
Okay. Okay, I see. Yeah. Okay. So I think it was the last question. So I would say thank you, Osinachi, for this fantastic talks. And we hope that all participants have enjoyed this webinar session. If you have any questions, so feel free to contact us by email. We will get back to you for all these questions. And again, thank you and see you soon, inshallah. Thanks, Osinachi. Thanks.
Thank you for having me. Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.